Well, Matt, it's Paul. I'm just commenting to your video. You made a response to the video. Not him, but I kind of think it's my video had it on the.
Yeah, it got pretty much on the point when talking about between government and the state and why the state is essential for the maintenance of capitalism. Now, before I get to property in the state, first I want to address the tragedy of the commons. You brought this up, where you said how public parks, public walkways are not really kept very well, public walking trails, that public property is generally not treated very well. You said the only because of force were the national parks kept clean. This is just a minor issue, but I mean, when I've been to national parks, there isn't really a large presence of park rangers. Generally, you can go out on your own, and generally people police themselves because it's generally very environmentalist-like people who spend long periods of time in these national parks, and they generally respect the idea. And in terms of public walking trails, that too, a private walking trail, which if you would really only exist on a very large estate, and not very many people would go on this. Of course, yes, you'd have more incentive to be clean on your private estate, but the real reason a private walking trail, a private estate would be cleaner, or it would seem more well kept, is because it doesn't see a lot of traffic. A public walking trail, it sees many people. If a very small portion pollute it, then it'll be polluted, especially if it's not cleaned in any regular way, and especially if we're in a society that doesn't have a respect for the environment other than as something that we can use. For instance, Native American culture had a genuine respect for the environment, and they did not have a concept of owning the environment. And this culture existed on this continent, and there were no problems with the environment. So that's an example of how anarchism, of some extent, or lack of ownership, can cause property to the environment to do well. Now, the argument made for the tragedy of the commons is that when land is either rented out or land is just considered nobody's, people have no incentive to take care of it, that they'll just take the resources and leave because it's not theirs. But the major flaw in this is that if it is theirs, they have incentive to stay, but not to keep it a forest. A forest is not lucrative. What is lucrative is, in some cases, lumber farms, which are nothing like forests. They're not good for the environment. They don't harbor many species. Or what's more likely they would do is just basic development. A factory, maybe they build apartment buildings, they build anything. Something that makes money, or they'd sell it to developers, which wouldn't be good for the environment in that case either. Okay, now on to property. You said how property wasn't ordained by the state. Now, you have to think of property in two senses. The state does two things with property. One is, well, the government and the state, they justify it. They give their moral justification, this is your property, and they protect it. Now, he's concentrated on is the state as a protector of property. Now, under Rothbard's system, people need to have their private property protected by, you said it would outsource to some company, and that because this is outsourced, and that it's not a monopoly on the use of violence, but that this can be outsourced, and that it's a free market on the use of violence. Problem with that is the state only pertains to the area that this is defending, that state is defending. By your logic, there is no state, because the monopoly on violence here in the United States is different, but the monopoly on violence in one country ends when you go to another country. There, if I go to Canada, the Canadian police have authority over me. If I go to Mexico, the Mexican police. If I go anywhere, that country's state has authority to use violence over me. The same way would be under the system where private companies would be given the right to use violence by the owner of land. They would act as the state on that piece of land. Now, if if every piece of land is very small, only enough for one person to live on, then perhaps it wouldn't be so feudalistic. But suppose people do buy large plots, or suppose people rent out property. I own a house, and I rent out the apartment below me. This person effectively acts in a state of serfdom because I control the land, and I control the use of violence in the land where he lives. And that's the main point of this argument: the state being the monopoly on the use of violence. And the one point, most of your points seem to make a lot of sense. I mean, they're wrong in a lot of ways. I say they're wrong. They're wrong, but I mean, I understand why you make this argument. One argument that I don't understand is you look at the chart. Now, I think it was clearly obvious that that chart, it showed that more than half of the spending was military. And we were talking about the state. So we really, these departments had nothing to do with what we're talking about. These departments are actually something that many anarchists think are good. For me, for instance, I'm an anarchist, but I am very much in favor of the New York Public Library. I'm very much in favor of the New York metro system. I need these things to function. And right now they're necessary evils, and I think, for a long time, anarchists have worked within, and all people with ideals have worked within the system they have in order to gain benefits, to improve themselves. And what he talked about was minimum wage laws. Yes, the anarchist struggle worked with the socialist struggle and other leftists, though many of them were leftist. Well, many people in the general leftist movement were statist, but many weren't. And the minimum wage law is something that was fought generally by the general population. And we fought it through government, because government is somewhat responsive to the people. And you said, what would happen in an anarchist society if there's no government to impose minimum wage? We're not anarcho-capitalists. We're anarchists. Well, I'm an anarchist, and there would be no wage slavery. That's the main one of the main arguments of anarchism, that wage slavery is a form of slavery, and that there would be no wages, that people's labor would not be quantified in money. So this argument doesn't make sense. And back on the issue of the state, you said, what does a base in Korea do to protect America's property? Well, it exists there for the purpose. We have property in Korea, and we don't want to lose it. Our state has been violent in other countries. We had property in Cuba. Many Americans had property in Cuba, and we lost it. We've attempted to take that property back through force, through the use of our state, but it's been unsuccessful. Now, our government has been very violent against other countries where we felt American property was at risk. One good example would be Guatemala. If you just look up the United Fruit, the banana massacre, there was workers for the United Fruit Company were organizing, and we fought. The United Fruit Company had utilized the CIA to basically slaughter them, to make sure there would be no communist uprising, and there would be no union activity, that they would gain as much money as they possibly could from that land. Another great example, which is really good for the modern day, would be the deposing of Mossadegh from Iran. That relates to current issues, so I think it's good to bring this up. How the Iranian people, they elected Mossadegh, and Mossadegh was he passed unanimously in the Congress of the Parliament of Iran, a bill to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and make it belong to the people of Iran. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, with the assistance of the British government, tried to bring this to the UN, but the UN ruled in favor of Mossadegh. They tried to go to Truman, wouldn't support it. Eventually, Eisenhower, he allowed the CIA to go, stage a coup, and we used our state in order to gain money for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, but many American oil companies, an oil collective, also gained a large portion and I think it was the Dutch company had 20%, 40, 40, and 20. But either way, it's an example of how the state exists around the world. So that map, it's how the state exists around the world to protect private property. And state private property. Anyway, that's it. Feel free to respond to this.